In part 3, I'm going to be bringing things back home by asking, where does Britain fit into this picture that I've been starting to map out of change versus continuity at the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s? Well, if you just look at who was in power, it might appear that 1989 comes in the middle of a long, continuous period of conservative dominance or hegemony from 1979 to 97. Despite being in power for a decade characterised by sharp rises in inequality, the Tories had in 1987 been re-elected by a comfortable margin. Sounds familiar. The period following the deregulation of the City of London in 1986 saw the apparent triumph of Thatcherite popular capitalism, particularly in southern England. The kinds of attitudes satirised by, amongst others, Harry Enfield and the Pet Shop Boys. Water was privatised in 1989 and electricity in 1990. And yet, something was deeply wrong in the UK. The most tragic manifestation of which was what happened at Hillsborough on the 15th of April 1989, about which third-year student Matthew Trafford will be speaking at the conference. And a backlash was already underway. Polling data suggests that Conservative support dropped sharply by around 15% between the beginning and the end of 89. By the spring of 1990, Neil Kinnock's Labour Party reached levels of support as high as the mid-50s, more like a 1945 level of popularity than anything seen this century. This is odd, considering that this was just when the collapse of communism, if we look at this in a broader European perspective, had apparently vindicated Thatcher's claim that there is no alternative to the free market. The Iron Lady who had ruthlessly crushed organised labour on the streets of South Yorkshire, as laid bare in another recent Edgehill PhD by Phil Rawsthorne, was nevertheless genuinely welcomed as a liberator by Polish trade unionists when she visited the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk in November 1988. So, a bit like Gorbachev, Thatcher was becoming more popular abroad than she was at home. Now, there's much room for debate about how we explain this paradox, but the most obvious explanation would be the poll tax, introduced in Scotland in 1989 and England and Wales in 1990. This became Thatcher's single most unpopular policy, due to the glaring unfairness of replacing local rates based on property values with a flat tax per adult, in which, as the minister responsible Nicholas Ridley himself put it, a duke would pay the same as a dustman. It sparked one of the most widespread campaigns of civil disobedience in recent history, and on the 31st of March 1990, what some claimed was the worst riot in central London for a century. But perhaps the poll tax debacle was merely a symptom of an underlying malaise with the way power operated in the British state, whose critics were increasingly looking beyond the classic two-party duopoly. The anti-poll tax movement was largely led from the extreme left. This was what gave the world Tommy Sheridan of Scottish militant Labour, who you see at the bottom left of the screen, as well as marking the height of notoriety of the anarchist grouplet Class War, you see at the bottom right, and therefore this movement led from the extreme left was consequently disapproved of by Neil Kinnock, who denounced them as what he called Toy Town revolutionaries. 1989 also saw strikes by dockers, rail workers, passport office workers, and ambulance crews. Indeed, even, shock horror, university lecturers. So there were already hints back then of the big story of Western politics in recent times. formerly conservative middle-class professionals moving to the left, even as some of the working classes were moving to the right. The newly merged Liberal Democrats, renamed as such in October 89, struggled at first, but by late 1990 were on a roll of winning by-elections. And the Green Party had come apparently from nowhere to suddenly win 15% of the national vote at the 1989 European elections, before equally suddenly falling away again. Guest speaker Andrew Permain will be exploring why in the afternoon session at the conference, but I think the British Green surge of 1989 fits within a broader international trend, namely a sharp rise in salience of the issue of environmental degradation, not least amongst civil society movements in Eastern Europe. Already by 1987 to 88, there were a significant number of environmental clubs and protests in the Soviet Union itself. You could tell that something was happening from the way that environmentalism briefly found an unlikely champion in the shape of Thatcher, who literally the day before the Berlin Wall fell became the first major world leader to address the UN General Assembly about climate change. This again makes this period look both familiar yet also jarring to us today when members of Thatcher's erstwhile inner circle, such as her former Chancellor Nigel Lawson, have become leading climate deniers. One possible diagnosis of the UK's problems was provided by Charter 88. The campaign founded via a special issue of the New Statesman in October 1988 to denounce what they called the intensification of authoritarian rule in the UK and call for an ambitious programme of constitutional reform. Charter 88 represented the first major challenge to the Westminster winner-takes-all system of what's sometimes been called elected dictatorship. The context being that with a divided opposition, the Tories could do almost anything they wanted on a minority of votes, an issue as relevant now as it was back in 1988. Although also supported by what would today be called centrists, Charter 88's driving figures like Anthony Barnett, who I later worked for as an intern in 1994, had really come from the libertarian radical left of 1968. Hence, it's significant that they sought to associate themselves with reform and opposition movements in Eastern Europe. Their name was a nod to Charter 77, the human rights petition in Czechoslovakia in 1977. Well, in 1988, Barnett had himself visited Gorbachev's USSR to write a travelogue called Soviet Freedom, which, despite the title, he, amongst other things, actually compares the corrupt workings of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to those of the British establishment, whilst eschewing any simplistic moral equivalence. In retrospect, Barnett points out that Charter 88 became a reference point in the country's politics in the course of 1989, and it belongs to that moment. He suggests that Charter 88 was really about wanting Britain to become a normal country. Interestingly, in the same way that the largely middle-class revolutionaries of Central Europe also sought to do, as they challenged their own stifling ancien regimes. Now, putting these various trends together without wishing to exaggerate the importance of any one in particular, it's worth asking whether 1989, or at least the period from 1989 to 92, marks a sharper break in British society than the more conventional emphasis on 1997. It's just that the break would be masked by John Major's unexpected victory at the 1992 general election. A victory that was rather short-lived, given that Labour were once again miles ahead in the polls continuously from the autumn of 1992 onwards. Now, one possible early sign of this possible kind of cultural break was that by the early 1990s, British youth culture was quite dramatically different from the bland corporate dominance of the 80s. Now, after everything we've heard so far, and we'll hear on the 22nd of March about people's struggles for basic democratic rights, it does feel more than a little self-indulgent to look at something as trivial as pop music. So at this point, I feel a bit like when Eric Hobsbawm moonlighted as the jazz critic of the New Statesman in the 1950s and 60s, but had to do so under a pseudonym for fear it would damage his reputation as a serious academic. But the first duty of the historian is to tell the truth, and the truth is that pop music was what was most important to me in the early 90s. I was not alone in this, clearly, amongst people who were young at the time in the UK, and not only in the UK. I've met people from France, Germany, and elsewhere who were influenced by the same largely British pop music of the time. So, after considering a lot of weighty matters, I'd like to end this lecture on a slightly lighter note by asking whether pop music can help us with this question about whether there was indeed a break in British society circa 1989 to 92. Well, that thesis has recently been put forward, very interestingly, by the conceptual artist Jeremy Deller, who's interested in the interconnections between popular culture and its wider socio-political context. And he's put forward this thesis in his 2019 documentary film for BBC4, Everybody in the Place. I was planning to show it at the original in-person version of this conference, so here's a link to watch it on YouTube if you're interested. And I think it is a very interesting film. It's framed a little like this conference as an intergenerational dialogue, with Deller lecturing to a group of A-level politics students today. Now, I'll let the film's thesis about what rave culture tells us about late 80s Britain speak for itself, and let you decide for yourselves whether or not it stands up to historical scrutiny. But as Everybody in the Place focused exclusively on electronic dance music, especially acid house, I wanted to add something about the other music genre that many see as having had a golden age around this time, namely indie rock, which I have more personal experience of, partly because I was just a bit too young for the height of acid house in 1988. Okay, so here goes. Indie rock can be subdivided into its two main subgenres of the early 90s. Indie dance, characterised by a cross-fertilisation between guitar-based sounds and techno-rave, and shoegaze, characterised by the fusion of pop melody with noise and feedback, and named after the propensity of the bands to gaze at their shoes rather than the audience during gigs, either because they were looking down at the effects pedals that helped shape their sound, or simply because they were shy. So here's a personal top 10 of some of my favourite songs, all released or recorded in 1991 to give you a sense of what the 16-year-old me was spending the proceeds of my paper round on. You by contrast, can of course find them all for free on YouTube should you be so inclined. Now, like all primary sources, my top 10 has its biases. It's a very Anglo-centric list. It's heavily biased towards indie or techno music made in the south of England, and towards the kind of thing that was deemed to be cool by those key arbiters of taste for early 90s indie kids, the weekly music press of the New Musical Express, NME, and Melody Maker, which I suppose, was what we had instead of social media. Now, we should be wary of generalisation, because you had to be slightly alternative to be into any of this kind of thing at the time, and plenty of people in the early 90s still listened to the much blander sort of 80s style music that filled much of the charts. Now, although, as you can see from that playlist, not all indie music from the time neatly fits into the indie dance versus shoegaze dichotomy, the demarcation between these two genres, amplified by the penchant of the music press for quasi-sociological commentary, was not just musical, but socio-cultural. Thus, it was generally considered that indie dance, especially the so-called baggy scene, centred on the vicinity of Manchester's Hacienda Club, was northern, working class, hedonistic, and masculine. By contrast, shoegazing, also known as the Thames Valley scene, because it was centred somewhere on an axis between Camden Town in North London, Reading, and Oxford, was represented as southern, middle class, arty, pseudo-intellectual, and somewhat more feminine. These categories start to break down, though, if we note, for example, that Blur, who by the time of their rather kind of media-manufactured war with Oasis in 1995, the time around when indie started to be referred to by the rather anachronistic term Britpop, Blur would be typecast as the ultimate middle-class Southern art school boys. But in 1991, they were going through a phase in their music, typified by the 12-inch remix of There's No Other Way, that was actually very baggy, influenced by northern bands like the Stone Roses, who in turn were strongly influenced by rave music. Indeed, it seems to me in retrospect that indie dance, rave and shoegaze all had something important in common, namely that they were very escapist. It was as if we were all trying to run away with what was wrong with British society by retreating into another world in our heads, on the dance floor and in the mosh pit. Although there was always something implicitly left-wing in indie music's anti-corporate ethos against the major labels, even when the lyrics were audible, which often they weren't, especially in shoegaze, there was little explicit political statement in most of the music that defined the period. Even at this more kind of left field end of the spectrum, the nearest you might get to a political statement in the charts in 1990 was the idea of being free to do what you want to do any old time, espoused by indie dance hits like I'm Free by the Soup Dragons or Loaded by Primal Scream, which, despite Primal Scream's own radical left politics, were in its audible messages barely distinguishable from Thatcherite individualism. Move forward to 1991, and as you can see from the asterisks, only 2 of my own top 10 of 1991, and most of these didn't get into the actual top 10, but only 2 of these contain an overt political message. They were the ones by Carter USM and the Levellers. So there's clearly a lot of escapism going on, and its various forms. And to give you a sense of what I mean by that, this is Slowdive, formed by a group of teenagers in Reading in 1989, amongst the most critically acclaimed of shoegaze bands, and the one that perhaps corresponded most closely to stereotypes about shoegaze. And they were the second band I ever went to see live at a festival in Slough in the summer of 91 that has apparently sort of gone down in history as the height of shoegaze. So here they are performing their track Catch the Breeze, which has been described as the most shoegaze thing ever. And that sense of escapism is why the Manic Street Preachers, the best known of a wave of bands who by 1992 to 93 actually would make it fashionable again to be angry and political, accused Slowdive of lulling the youth of Britain into depoliticised apathy with the provocatively offensive quotation that you see at the bottom of the screen. Talk about a sense of proportion. Yet there were better aimed elements of social critique in some music of the turn of the decade. In a minute, I'm going to play as our musical finale Sheriff Fat Man by Carter USM, a South London duo renowned for their witty explorations of the detritus of post-Thatcherite Britain, who were the very first band I saw live at the Brixton Academy in June 1991. Sheriff Fat Man is about the inequities of the housing market, an issue as relevant today as when this was first written in 1989. It makes, though, a number of contemporary references, which may need explaining to a modern audience. To granny farming, meaning fraudulently obtaining proxy votes in elections by manipulating older residents of care homes. To the Enterprise Allowance Scheme, a flagship policy of the Thatcher government to subsidise unemployed people to set up their own businesses. The beneficiaries of which ironically did include some well-known indie music impresarios. To Nicholas van Hoogstraten, a particularly unpleasant character who in the 80s was Britain's most notorious landlord. To Peter Rackman, an even more notorious slum landlord from 1950s London. To Crossroads, a popular soap set in a motel in the West Midlands. And finally, and most notoriously of all, to Klaus Barbie, the so-called Butcher of Lyon. The Gestapo chief in the French city of Lyon, put on trial in 1987 because of his personal role in the torture and murder of 14,000 people, including Jewish men, women and children, and members of the French resistance. Klaus Barbie's was one of the most prominent of an extremely belated wave of war crimes trials in France, typically due to the defendants having fled to South America by taking advantage of their status as anti-communists during the Cold War to escape justice. So, interesting that rather typically the one and only reference to continental Europe in this song is about Nazism, which might tell us something about the nature of British identities. And also interesting that the references to the physical weight of the fictional composite character, the fictional landlord Sheriff Fat Man, would probably today be considered body shaming. But at any rate, here it is.
Sheriff Fat Man started out in business as a granny farmer. He was infamous for 15 minutes and he appeared on Panorama. Then he somehow got himself on board the Starship Enterprise Allowance Scheme with a Prince of Wales Award for pushing Valium and amphetamine. On the second base behind Nicholas Van What's His Face at 6'6" and 100 tons, the undisputed king of the slums with more aliases than Klaus Barbie, the master butcher of Leon C. Just about to take the stage, the one and only hold the front page. Fat Man's got something to sell to the capital's homeless, and the Crossroads Motel for the no fixture voters. You can live life in style, you can sleep in a closet. Flash him a smile and take your 2,000 deposit. There's bats in the belfry, the windows are jammed, the toilets ain't healthy, you don't give a damn. chuckles and smiles, laughs like a man, a born again black man, hitman, shouting Batman.
So, to sum up, the evidence as to the historical question of whether or not the big C and indeed small c conservative hegemony of 80s Britain was being challenged by the early 90s points in different directions. So sometimes I wonder whether or not some of the political, social, or cultural attitudes often seen as the exclusive property of younger people today were already prefigured by aspects of alternative culture back then, just as some of those were in turn descended from elements of youth cultures of the 1960s and 70s. And that may be something we have opportunity to debate in the first panel of the afternoon session on Britain. But it's only right and proper that we will begin the day with where that 1989 moment began in Central and Eastern Europe, and with Ruxandra Trandafou and Owen Evans, who were there. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you on the 22nd of March.